Hi, I'm James Graham, CEO of Recce Pharmaceuticals, ASX RCE. Thank you for joining us today, where we focus upon our Q4 FY26 highlights and investor presentation. So, who is Recce Pharmaceuticals? Recce Pharmaceuticals is a leading Australian anti-infective company which is approaching near-term commercialisation milestones focused upon the unmet medical need of diabetic foot ulcer infections. We, in fact, have two phase 3 candidates, one in Indonesia, which, if approved in Indonesia, as we're on track for later this calendar year, would be approvable across the ASEAN group of countries, the Middle East, and beyond. In Australia, of course, we have a phase 3 study focused upon the US FDA, and that study has broadened and expanded in its clinical setting. And it's a very exciting opportunity to see the US FDA engage with that and, in fact, bring our timelines forwards. As we look to the commerciality of this candidate, we're very pleased to see one of the highest diabetes prevalence regions, which is the Middle East, step forward with one of the leading Middle Eastern pharmaceutical companies providing a term sheet for a 10-year exclusive multi-country license. That's a fantastic validation of this technology and indicating a 30 to 36% net royalty, and of course, upon a major patient population. We continue to advance multiple candidates through their respective clinical and preclinical programs, and particularly when we look towards the US Department of Defense, where we have three US Army or US Department of War programs, and they are certainly advancing through their natural stages. As we look to our markets, when we think of a topical application, the highest price premium you can have is focused upon diabetic foot ulcer infections. It's a market of around 5.8 billion US dollars. And of course, when you break into the regions of countries, you see diabetes running really in an uncontrolled fashion. Over 20 million have diabetes in Indonesia, over 84 million in the MENA group of countries, MENA being the Middle Eastern group, that we have that term sheet advancing to a definitive agreement. And what it really represents is 1 in every 3 adults who have diabetes will get a diabetic foot ulcer. And I can tell you, around 80% of those ulcers become infected. There is no standard of care specifically for the treatment of diabetic foot ulcer infections. We are positioned as it. We work broader than any other antibiotic known to date. We work faster than any other antibiotic known to date. And that means we have capability to serve this unmet medical need. And of course, when you look to the cases of hospitalizations and amputation, it is a very significant need at that. So some of the key highlights in just the last quarter alone, it's been a busy time and I expect that to continue ahead. You'll see on a clinical basis and of course a regulatory and a commercial basis, major advances. So in Australia, our DFI, standing for Diabetic Foot Ulcer Infection Study, is in its pivotal phase 3 status. It's a registrational study. It's a study that the US FDA are expected to accept that clinical data from. For those who don't know, in fact, there's more phase 1 clinical data submitted to the US FDA than from Australia than there is from any other country around the world. So they're well versed to Australian sites. What we've really done is we've gone from just the mild infection status, which is say 30% of the market, to include the mild and moderate infection status, which is now 80% of the market. And we're positioned, of course, to treat upfront, treat with confidence, and treat liberally, knowing that it will work on any type of bacteria that is present, and it will stop that bacteria in its tracks. For what it's worth on a pharmaceutical basis, when we look to the commercialization, we're actually very complementary to existing therapies because when a patient has an infected ulcer, and we've got many examples of that, you can't graft that infected ulcer, you can't suture that ulcer closed, you can't sell regenerative medicine if that ulcer is infected. So we're really a sales enabler as we're increasingly discovering with our commercial partners. So on that basis, we have a non-binding but very indicative term sheet with a leading Middle Eastern pharmaceutical company. The proposed agreement is a 10-year agreement. I think it's around 11 countries. and it's of a 30 to 36% net royalty on a proposed sales price of around 1,500 US dollars. That's a very, very attractive agreement, and we look forward to progressing that to a definitive agreement, which we're very active with right now. Looking back, of course, to Indonesia. So we've got one phase 3 in Australia and we've got another phase 3 in Indonesia. Why? Australia is focused upon the US FDA. Indonesia is approvable across the ASEAN and the Middle East. And the Indonesian Regulatory Authority, BPOM, which is the Indonesian FDA, completed a comprehensive inspection of multiple sites, the clinical sites that our study is taking place in, and of course, all the audit and process they go through there. There was no significant findings, no required changes, and in fact, it was a wonderful green light to proceed and in fact expand as we have now done. So our global expansion is really focused again initially on this topical application. I mentioned, of course, the highest price premium is diabetic foot ulcer infections. As we know, in certain regions, there may be off-label use. You might use it for a acute bacterial skin and skin structure infection. You may use it for a burn infection, any infection, it doesn't matter, but they're paying a price premium when they utilize that. And that is why we are positioned in that instance. So that commercialization across the region continues. This is where we'll pass across to my colleague, Dr. Alan Dunton, our Chief Medical Advisor and fellow board member. Thank you, Alan.
Thank you very much, James. I'm Dr. Alan Dunton. I am the Consulting Chief Medical Officer for Recce Pharmaceuticals. It's my pleasure to be here today to talk about our incredible progress in our fourth quarter 2026 update to investors. Now, why do I say that's incredible progress? It's because we're starting a registrational phase 3 clinical trial in Australia. We, as you know, have an ongoing study in Indonesia, which is phase 3. And now we're studying a similar trial, I'll explain the differences, in Australia within weeks. The study is designed as a randomized active comparator trial. What is that? That's where a patient is randomized to receive Recce 327 gel for diabetic foot infection, or they're randomized to get an approved product, an oral antibiotic product for the treatment of that infection, which is at the discretion of the principal investigator. We'll be at up to 15 sites across Australia. I have spoken to most of them already and the investigators, and everybody's very excited about this study. That active comparator study is absolutely necessary. I'm sure you'd want to know how we stack up against an oral drug that's out there already. And as you know, we feel that this gel, and we know this gel is very active, hopefully more active than the comparator. We feel it will be, but also more convenient. Doesn't have the bad side effects of oral antibiotics. If you've ever been on an oral antibiotic for 2 weeks, there are significant effects that they have that are undesirable. Upset stomach, perhaps some GI effects that we don't need to go into in this presentation, but we're very excited about this. So this study is starting shortly, and we'll be having an interim analysis. This is about 200 patients will be enrolled across Australia. The interim analysis will be occurring later in 2027, and then we'll have the readout in late next year or early part of 2028. This study will also enable a much more significant discussion with the US FDA, who is used to working with the Australian Therapeutic Goods Administration, or TGA, on a regular basis. It not only is an active comparator trial, but it will also enroll patients not only with mild diabetic foot infection, but with moderate diabetic foot infection. The mild patients make up about 25% or so of all diabetic foot infection patients. This will add a significant percent as well, 40 to 50% of the total DFI population. So we've just considerably broadened who can be enrolled in this trial. In addition, we will be including patients who also have, who also have infections of diabetic ulcers below the knee. So it's not only the foot, it's below the knee. So we expect this trial to go exceedingly well. The protocol meets all FDA standards, as all our studies have to date, and we look forward to getting this started, as I mentioned, in the next few weeks. The endpoints are the same endpoints that we've used in the phase 3 in Indonesia. It's a clinical response of the diabetic foot infection according to the now famous Lipsky scale, with secondary endpoints including a total wound score and safety. We're also doing some microbiology in this study in moderate diabetic foot infection patients so that we will actually find which bugs we have successfully treated in this trial. So we're very excited about this. Becoming a phase 3 clinical trials company in the biotech slash pharma world is very significant, and this trial will garner more attention than we're already getting right now. So in the next slide, let me talk to what's going on in Indonesia. The trial continues to be enrolled. The BPOM, the Biden POM, which is the FDA equivalent in Indonesia, has conducted an inspection. It's not for cause, it's routine. They pick a site and they go to the site and they inspect, and they do a very thorough job, I must say. When I've been part of FDA inspections, I've not been part of an Indonesian inspection. But there were no findings which they considered consequential enough to even stop the study or to give us any kind of warning, which FDA would at any point in time. They can slow your study down. We are continuing to move ahead, and we look forward to an interim analysis on that study in the not too distant future. So they haven't requested any changes to the protocol at all. But we continue to dose across the 5 sites. And we had a nice quote there, as you can read. I'm not going to read it for you, from the Indonesian Minister of Health, Mr. Sadikin. He knows the country needs this drug, this topical gel for this condition. It's a major, major has a major impact on health in patients in Indonesia and worldwide. So it's a brief update, and I was happy to provide it for you at this time. But now let me pass it along to our chairman, Dr. John Prendergast.
Thank you, Alan. Now let's look at our pipeline and how it's structured through to 2030, anchored by our lead indication, that is for diabetic foot infections. Starting with diabetic foot ulcer infections, we're conducting trials in Indonesia, where we're currently generating phase 3 data towards a 155 patient readout. Now, positive Indonesian phase 3 data, together with subsequent regulatory approval, would support the start of our commercialization activities, not only in Indonesia, but extending that to ASEAN and to MENA. Importantly, this Indonesian trial data is being used as the foundation of our global registration strategy, feeding into registration beyond Indonesia and through the ASEAN countries and into MENA. That same 327 topical program also extends beyond diabetic foot ulcer infections to DFI and ABSSSI, which is acute bacterial soft skin and skin structure infections, in Australia and the USA. We'll be running additional clinical trials for registration purposes and generating data to support this in Australia, and hopefully gain US approval at the end of 2027. Next, with regard to our Recce 327 intravenous program, phase 1 is complete, and the drug was shown to be extremely safe and well tolerated in over 120 healthy volunteers. And now we are positioned for potential phase 2 trials. In addition to that, we're also developing our Recce 327 inhaled formulation that will target lung infections, specifically hospital-acquired pneumonia and ventilated-assisted pneumonia. We're currently in preclinical activities and look confidently towards bringing that program into the human trials in the next 12 months. We also have our Civil and Department of War programs focused on burn wound infections in the USA. This includes preclinical studies of Recce 327 gel, with the Department of War progressing to a registration trial for burn wounds in the not too distant future. And finally, on the science side, our mechanism of action paper is in process of being prepared for publication in a preeminent peer-reviewed journal that will highlight the incredible innovation that underlies the science across all of these programs. Now, building on that pipeline, let's zoom out to the bigger picture. Our Indonesian regulatory approval will be used as a foundation for a cascading global approval strategy across multiple regions, as I just mentioned. Starting from that Indonesian approval, we see 4 expansion vectors: expansion into ASEAN and MENA, expansion to Australia and New Zealand, and then expansion to the USA and Department of Defense, and global approvals more broadly. Underpinning this regional expansion is our platform's versatility across 3 delivery formats and new indications. With regard to the gel, covering DFI, AB SSI, and burns. IV will cover complicated urinary tract infections, IV sepsis, and IV single dosing for UTI. And with respect to the aerosol formalization, as I mentioned, this will cover hospital-acquired pneumonia, ventilator-assisted pneumonia, non-TB mycobacteria, and intranasal sinusitis. So the strategic story here is one regulatory approval in Indonesia doesn't just open one market. It's designed to cascade into approvals across multiple regions, as I've mentioned here, while the underlying platform expands into new formats and indications well beyond our lead DFI infection program. So that global strategy is bearing fruit. Recce has signed a non-binding term sheet with a leading Middle Eastern pharmaceutical company for a 10-year exclusive multi-country licensing agreement covering R327G across the MENA regions. Now, there are 4 things I want to highlight here. First, this unlocks the MENA diabetes market. The scale of the opportunity here is really significant. The MENA region has a diabetes prevalence of about 17.5%, representing over 84 million people. And in Saudi Arabia alone, 30% of the adult population have been diagnosed with diabetes. The term sheet coverage spans not only the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the GCC countries, but also United Arab Emirates, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, and Qatar. Secondly, this validates premium pricing. The non-binding term sheet stipulates a proposed selling price of USD $1,500 per treatment, or a price mutually agreed with the KSA regulatory authority. However, under the terms, Recce is expected to receive 30% of the next selling price and an additional 6% royalty on net sales. Third, there's data harmonization from Indonesia. Our successful data readouts in Indonesia, together with subsequent regulatory approval, support commercialization there, and importantly, may support similar regulatory approval and commercialization in other ASEAN markets. Now, pending the positive phase 3 results from our ongoing Indonesian trial, we don't expect these additional clinical trials will be required to support a marketing authorization application in Saudi Arabia. And finally, this is a commercial partnership with a leading company. Our partner is recognized as one of the leading pharmaceutical companies in the MENA region, with a strong sales portfolio across dermatology, endocrinology, and infectious diseases, and established market access throughout the region, positioning them well to accelerate the adoption and distribution of our Recce 327 gel. In short, this non-binding term sheet is a positive step towards the potential commercialization of our R327 gel in one of the world's most significant diabetes markets. And with that, I'll hand it back to James.
Thank you, John, for that update on our commercialization and expansion strategy. Over to intellectual property. Intellectual property is the foundation of any pharmaceutical business, and in the case of synthetic polymeric antibiotics or anti-infectives for human uses, Recce really owns that space. In fact, here we see 4 families of patents covering composition of matter patents, method of manufacture, method of administration, method of treatment, and the process for preparation of a biologically active polymer. It's another name for how to make it. You'll see these patents are granted all around the world. In fact, there's about 90% of the world's pharmaceutical markets represented here, taking our market monopolies out to 2041, in fact, beyond, with additional patent families lodged in the background at this moment. So a very strong patent strategy there. We have a present capital raise at this moment. In fact, it's a raise that is focused upon strengthening our balance sheet. Our balance sheet is particularly important as we engage in commercial licensing. As we've seen, we've announced a significant term sheet with a leading Middle Eastern pharmaceutical company. And really, as we transition from that term sheet to a definitive agreement, we want to be in our best position possible. In fact, it would be reasonably expected with a late-stage phase 3 candidate to have multiple licensing negotiations going on in what is a regional licensing play, of course, across other regions of the world. We're obviously utilising some of that capital to firm up our clinical studies, of which we have 2 phase 3 programs at the moment, and supporting our US FDA activities as well. We've slightly extended the SPP from what was to be close of business Monday to now close of business Friday. And shareholders that were available on the record date at 40 cents per share, etc., can subscribe for around $30,000 each. This is our capital snapshot. So, of course, where the company is on an equity basis, a market cap of around 115 million Australian, of which the top 20 shareholders represent about 57% of the company. As a reminder, they include groups like Fidelity, one of the biggest investment groups in the world, still own about 8.5%, 9% of the company. My family, by example, still has about 20% of the company. And where it really leaves us as a breakdown of our cash position is utilising some equity, but really non-dilutionary cash to drive our path forwards. So we announced recently the Australian Tax Office provided $3.6 million in non-dilutionary caveat-free cash. In fact, this year, having just completed the recent financial year, we're presently submitting for a further R&D rebate from the ATO. That R&D rebate will be around $7.5 million, and we'd expect that around October, November of this year, as we have in every other year previously. We also have a non-dilutive capital position with Avenue Capital Group in the background that could provide us an additional 10 million in near-term financing. And with the small equity raise that we are completing at this moment, it leaves us in a pro forma cash position of around $33.1 million. In fact, that's up from $25.5 million when we announced this raise, and that's a result of the additional R&D rebates. So in summary, Recce Pharmaceuticals, it has the ability, of course, to work and keep on working with repeated use, unlike any other antibiotic or anti-infective known to date. Why that's important is we're commercially valuable today in the context of what our compound delivers. And as we continue to use that and the bacteria continue to grow and multiply, we do not succumb to antibiotic resistance. We work as well as we do in every single passage, and we've demonstrated that in well over 500 different bacterial species. There are no signs of resistance to Recce 327. And in fact, in our mechanism of action studies, we've identified that it's statistically impossible for there to be any resistance to Recce 327. As a company, it's an exciting time in that we are at the stage of commercialization. We have 2 phase 3 studies, and that represents a near-term inflection point in regards to our Indonesia study. Our Indonesia study focused upon diabetic foot ulcer infections is expected to commercialize or be approved at the end of this year. That means with that data pack applicable across the ASEAN group of countries, Middle East and beyond, it is sell, sell, sell into 2028 and beyond. Of course, in Australia, 2027 beyond, I should say. In Australia, that same study focused upon the US FDA is expected to be approved at the end of 2027, and that would be the US, Europe, and beyond. We're commercializing, as we've shown, we have a very positive term sheet demonstrating a 30 to 36% net royalty on a proposed selling price of around 1,500 US dollars. For those interested in the US, the proposed selling price is around 3,500 US dollars, but we'll elaborate a little more on that along the way. And this is the first new class of antibiotics in over 40 years. In fact, interestingly, the discovery of penicillin was discovered in 1927, and the commercialization of Recce is going to be right on the centenary of 2027 of the discovery of antibiotics, and we continue to push that path forwards. That concludes today's investor presentation. I'm James Graham, Managing Director and CEO. Thank you for listening.